After f4, d5, knight f3, the way I suggest to continue is g6. So black player will play the bishop in fianchetto. Now there's two main ways to play. The vast majority of times e3 is played with the bishop to go in e2, but sometimes also g3 with the bishop in fianchetto, which is less popular. So after e3 main move, bishop g7 and bishop e2, black continues with c5, beginning a struggle for the d4 square. Two main moves we're going to look at, although many moves are kind of interchangeable, castle and d3. After d3, although castling is going to happen anyway, let's look at d3 first and then castling first. Black continues with knight f6, and after castle, this is a quiet opening, so it's not like nothing's really going to happen at the beginning, so all of these moves will just happen anyway. White continues with knight to c3, for instance. As I say in every video, there's going to be just too many possible moves that can happen. It's trillions of moves, but every setup, every opening creates some strengths and weaknesses, and we're going to target them. So what's with this f4 opening? Well, this is the setup. White has a pawn in f4 attacking e5, and then these two pawns like this, and the pawn in c, this could be pushed. We will look at it later. And black will play d5 c5 to control the central squares. So this is not supposed to be a very good opening. And also another setup we will look at is the one with the stone wall, like pawn in d4 with backward pawn in e3. So what we need to do is try to understand how to play against this, rather than memorizing moves. Black now continues with knight to c6 to keep control over d4. So the move I'm going to look at in this line is the obvious e4. Why e4? Because it's going to swap some pawns in the center and it will allow white to develop the bishops. Otherwise, white can't develop anything ever. This bishop can only go to d2. And anyway, I will also go through a line without e4, but stick to the end of the video and you'll see all of the possible setups. After e4, black punishes it with d4. White going to d5 means that white loses a pawn. White knight going to a4 is misplaced because then b6 means this knight can't move anywhere ever unless white wants to put the knight in fianchetto, but then the game white will be taking too many tempos away from himself. So after knight to b5 and a6 and knight to a3, black continues with b5. Now to close this line so that we understand how to play more or less in this case, it was crucial that we understood that a move like e4 to crash the center is met by d4 closing the center, because that allowed us to take so much space on the queen side, and also it stopped development of the white pieces. Two main moves, and then we will close this line and quickly go to the next one. One of them is c4, an attempt of start challenging the pawns on the queen side. The other one is knight to e5. Let's go through c4 first. c4 is met by pawn taking en passant, believe it or not. The reason is that after the pawn takes, black can play b4, and this is now a fork, so white will have to take. Otherwise, black wins a pawn for free. So after pawn takes, black now can take the pawn in e4 with the knight with the discover attack on the rook. So this was going to happen anyway, and the best move by the engine is to take the knight in e4. Obviously, because the knight going to c3 will be forking the queen and rook anyway. So after pawn takes and bishop takes, black is completely weak. If pawn were to take in c5, then bishop d4 will just save, black will be so much up in material. And if bishop to e3 allowing an attack on the bishop, black can still play bishop to d4 and retain the material advantage. Back in this position, let's look at knight to e5. It's a move I've encountered a lot. You might be wondering, e5 looks much more natural, but it's a very silly move because in this position you cannot play. You can play the f4, e5, d4 pawn structure, and that could be very solid and very annoying, but black has a pawn in d4. So this e5 pawn here just creates holes, like in d5 for instance, and that makes the movements of the black player much better. Knight e5 is a move I've encountered a lot in this position because after knight takes and pawn takes, black is forced to go to e8 and white has opened the rook, also opened the diagonal for the bishop, so it looks like actually white is okay. So the next move is bishop to f4 to defend the pawn, and now black continues with knight to c7. A few more moves before ending this line, but there's not much to say except the fact that the black player is safe in here. Best move according to the engine by white is bishop to g4 in order to make this queen participate into the game. As a matter of fact, there was no other way to get the white bishop to do something. So after bishop takes and queen takes, knight e6 is the best move, targeting the bishop. And what's the advantage that we've got so far? The fact is that this knight is misplaced and it will take a lot of tempos before coming into the game. It looks like white position is quite active, but white is like down a piece. This knight will have to take his time before playing. Best move now, according to the engine, as a matter of fact, is knight to b1 to get the knight into the game. Black continues with queen to c7, applying more pressure over the pawn in e5. And white leaves it there. It's not the best thing to try and defend it. For example, queen to g3 wouldn't make any sense because we're still attacking the bishop and we will still have other two pieces over e5. So after knight to d2, knight takes f4, and after queen takes and bishop takes, and queen to h4 in order to protect h2. Then black will finish this, capitalize with bishop to f6, queen to g4. These are all best moves. Black is up a pawn, and his pawns on the queen side are more advanced. So this is the advantage that we've got. Last couple of best moves just to finish this line will be h5 attacking, and after queen to h3, g3 will favor a swap, which is good for black. After queen to h3 and bishop to g5 attacking the knight, knight f3, bishop to e3 check, king moves, and now black finishes with c4. Black is controlling the square c1, and black will also be able to place the rook on the c file, depending on what white does. Position like the position for the black player is considered much better at this point. So let's just move on to the other line. After f4, d5, knight f3, g6, e3, bishop g7, bishop e2, c5. So earlier we went through this d3 and then castle, but that's kind of like transposable anyway. Let's go immediately through castle, which is the most popular move, right? Black plays knight to f6, and now two main options. One of them is the stone wall that I promised to go through. This is often found very annoying, especially after c3. White creates this super annoying wall that really cannot be broken anytime, and then especially after the move like knight e5, it will take many moves for black to start enjoying some freedom. Anyway, this is nothing to worry too much. Before going to d4, let's quickly go through bishop b5, the bishop moving again with check. How do we respond to this? Knight b to d7. It is crucial to understand one of the things about this, about fighting the bird opening, is that black wants to keep these four pawns well safe to go on a rush on the queen side. Knight to c6 allowing white to build pressure to break the pawn structure. This is not favorable. There's nothing particularly wrong with that anyway. The best thing to do is knight b to d7. Now let's go. What happens after knight e5? Building more pressure over the knight. This move was going to happen anyway. White will have ideas in the future like f5. This is all very typical and thematic, and if you're a good player, you've seen these scenarios so many times. So what to do in such a situation? Black castles. Just ignore that, there's nothing to worry now. And after queen f3, black can now take the knight, pawn takes back, and now knight to g4, putting more attack over the square e5. So after pawn to d4, surprisingly, well, not that surprisingly, we take the pawn d4, pawn takes back, and now queen to b6, attacking this pawn and the bishop. And white will have to choose. Best thing is knight to c3, protecting the bishop. In fact, queen takes d5 looks like it's defending these two at the same time, but that's not good because bishop takes e5, excellent move. The bishop's protected by the knight, so the queen can't take. The pawn is pinned, so can't take. So black won a central pawn, and after h3, kicking away the knight, removing the defender of the bishop, and also saving the pawn from the attack of the bishop or the knight, well, probably the bishop. Black now plays bishop to e6, attacking the queen, and when the queen moves away, still keeping control of the pawn in d4, the bishop can take the pawn. Back here in this position, needless to say, knight c3 was the best chance for white, but then after queen takes d4, black has just got a solid advantage and should be easily win this game. So back from the starting position, after the usual moves, and then e3, bishop g7, and then the bishop e2, c5, and then castle. Black continues with development, knight f6. So earlier we went through bishop e5 check. What happens with the stonewall type of setup? Black will castle. We ignore the fact that this pawn can be taken in c5, even though we don't have the bishop guarding that pawn, and white might try to defend that pawn forever, because when they play the stonewall, f4, e3, d4, this type of reverse pyramid, if they take you like that, it's not the end of the world, especially because then the pawn in d will no longer be there, giving so much support to the square e5. So that means that the control that white has over the square e5 will still be good enough for white, but not as good as it can be right now. So let's just mention now three main ideas, and then we will close this video. Let's mention this idea first of all, because it's getting more and more popular recently. It's the fianchetto from the other side, especially because this bishop has no future from this diagonal, the central diagonal. So after b3, knight to c6, bishop to b2 is met, pawn takes pawn. And now let's go through knight takes in d4. The reason why not going through pawn takes in d4 is because then the fianchetto bishop would be completely pointless, because there will be no other way to ever mobilitate this bishop, especially since black eventually will play moves like bishop f5 or e6 to protect the pawn, and then white will not be able to open up this dark square bishop. So if pawn takes, then best move is bishop to f5, and the game looks really silly for white. And even though we're still getting out of the opening, black is already like minus 150. Anyway, after knight takes in d4, which makes much more sense, black continues with queen to b6, attacking the very strong diagonal. So of course the knight cannot really move, because otherwise white loses a pawn. c3 to defend the knight is silly, because it makes this bishop weaker, as we've seen. Let's only explore this other idea before we go on to the next line. After c4, the idea that they might have, this is very popular, it happens a lot, but it's not good, because then pawn takes and bishop takes. It looks like white has developed two very good bishops. Everything looks completely fine, but then knight to g4 is a thematic move in this type of position due to the backwards pawns attacking e3, and it's also now allowing black to have three attackers over d4. So how's white going to defend? The queen f3, for instance, simply loses to knight takes in d4, right? So the queen cannot go and play this normal looking move, because it just loses. It gives up the defense over the knight. A move that looks like it does everything is queen d2, protecting the pawn, stopping the fork, and still controlling the knight. This is now met by the great move knight to e3. Super strong move, attacking the bishop, threatening to smash the pawn structure and allow black to go to the endgame with the bishops, attacking the rook. So let's not go through queen takes knight for obvious reasons, but let's go through white's best attempt, which is knight to c6. It looks crazy because it gives black the possibility to make a discover attack, but this is the engine's move, and the reason is this is actually quite deep, but black has been winning this game anyway. How to continue? Knight takes bishop with check, and now bishop blocks in d4. Not very easy to see such move, but black has to be careful now and calculate well. Knight to d2, and now bishop takes the queen, and now knight takes rook, and we still have two pieces hanging here. So after bishop going back to f2, white, it's an open game, so white will have to save the bishop. Black will take the knight in c6, and then the king will take the knight, and black will go on to win the endgame. Oh, and by the way, just a move ago, before going back to f2, what happens after the knight e7? It looks like a Zwischenzug. The problem with that is that black will still have an attack on the rook. So if knight takes, king moves, and then white moves the bishop, let's not forget about the rook as well. So there was no Zwischenzug, at least no valid ones. Let's talk about the stone wall once again. So after knight f3 and the bishop, fianchetto, right? That's how we're dealing against the bird. Now c5 and then castle and knight f6. So as we said, d4, black castles. So earlier we went to this idea of b3. What happens after c3? This is much more familiar, I suppose, for many of us. Black now will continue with knight to c6. And now the most familiar and most annoying move that everyone hates to face, which is this knight e5. The knight is well placed in there, and that knight is there to stay. So what to do now? This is how we tackle this type of move. I'm pretty sure there's so many of us that really wants to know how to stop suffering because of this setup. Well, this is the solution. Queen to c7, right? We start putting pressure over this square. Well, even though it looks like we're never going to be able to get there. Now white continues with knight to d2, potentially knight to f3 to give even more support to that knight. Black now plays bishop to e6, crucial move that puts control over the square. f7 that might be weak later on, and also speeds up development. We couldn't really go anywhere meaningful with that bishop. And also sometimes if you play a move like bishop to d7, the white player might think of giving you the knight for the bishop, because this bishop, the light square bishop, is actually very strong. If you think about it, if you look at the freedom that he will enjoy potentially in this game, and then they will play knight f3 and knight f3 and then knight e5, and then you have achieved nothing. So bishop e6 is the best move, and after knight goes to f3. Now surprisingly, we need to take the knight, and after the knight takes back, knight to e4. So this is now our turn to place a monster knight in our opponent territory. Two main ideas we will see. One of them is a simple development of the bishop, t2, or bishop to f3, attacking the knight, trying to break the pawn structure. After bishop f3, black continues with c4. So remember this structure. Why c4? Because if this is what white wants to do, then white is giving up the good bishop, and he will be left with a silly bishop. So c4 creates a blockade of dark square pawns. So for instance, bishop takes, pawn takes. Black has got the bishop pair, and white's got a silly bishop. And yeah, you have now successfully dealt with that annoying setup of the knight in e5 and all these pawns. So that's not good for white. So back in this position after bishop f3, of course, c4. What happens after b3? This is simply not good, and this take and this pawn is definitely not poisoned, and black has now massively reduced white's control of the center. So back in this position, instead of bishop f3, what happens after knight bishop to d2? Again, c4, and now a normal move like rook to c1, idea of putting more defense over the pawn so that white can open up and start undermining the control of the light squares that black has. Black plays a5. The idea is to play rook to a6 and involve the rook like that, and also threaten the pawn in b2 with the rook. And besides, if white were to play b3, black will have always the option of playing b5, so there's nothing to worry there. Black's bishops are better. And yeah, there's just too many things. Like, I think I've been able to explain as many concepts as possible about this type of setups that arise after the bird opening, the f4 opening. Let's just play just a quick move, just a random move to see how we're going to go on with this game. Let's say a3, black continues with rook a6, and now white cannot play b3 anyway, also because pawn takes, that's for free. The queen cannot take back due to the knight taking the bishop. So let's try this. Bishop e1, trying to get the bishop to another diagonal. Black rook goes to b6, targeting the weak pawn. That would have been possible even if white hadn't played a3. After queen to c2, trying to defend the pawn, black continues with knight to d6. And again, one other point I can make about this knight, protected by all these pawns and this stone wall setup, is that you just leave it there sometimes, right? And you just don't worry, because it's a useless knight if you think about it. Although it looks very well placed, it's not a threat. Knight to d6. And let's go on a few more moves and then we'll close the video after bishop to f3. Best moves are f6, finally attacking the knight, also exploiting the fact that the knight can't really go to f3. So remember this pattern when you see the f3 square is taken, force the knight to go to g4. What it's going to lose is spot to be in e5 anyway, and yeah, remember f6 is not a problem in this opening. Best move now is bishop to f5, attacking the queen. And now where does the queen go? Well, she will have to go somewhere that loses control of the pawn in b2 and black will win. Queen f2 is not possible because h5 traps the knight. Queen d2 looks possible. Bishop to e4, trading the better bishop of the opponent. And so that's going to be much better for black. If white tries to save that bishop by going to e2, queen to d7 now, putting pressure on the knight and also trying to go to the pawn cannot push to a4 because it will be taken. After a move like h3, for instance, giving the knight the possibility to go to h2 and then potentially f3, white continues with a4, consolidating the control over b5. So after knight h2, which gives white the best chances, but still white is losing. Queen b5 puts so much pressure and black should be winning the game easily.